For the state of Utah, the winter of 87 or 88 was a relatively mild one. The Wasatch Mountains still got their usual dusting of snow, but for us lowlanders, I remember there being a lot less snow that winter. We got some snow here in Marion around the holidays, which was nice because it wouldn't have felt quite the same without it. But other than that, it was one of the mildest I can remember. I was a deputy in the sheriff's office at the time, so we all welcomed the less hazardous driving conditions, and I remember thinking that we might have just gotten off easy that winter. But boy, was I wrong about that. The first sign of trouble came in January when early on the morning of the 16th, a bomb ripped through Marion's LDS Mormon chapel and caused over $1 million in damages. Since the bomb was rigged to explode at 3 a.m., no one was around when it went off, but it shocked everyone in town. Only about 600 people live there, by the way, because who the hell would want to blow up a church like that? Well, it wasn't long before detectives started to form a pretty solid picture of who was to blame, and strangely, it involved a man who had been dead for the last 9 years. And to tell the story of why the Mormon chapel got blown up, you gotta tell the story of a guy named John Singer. He was born in New York City, but since his parents were from Dresden, they returned to World War II Germany when he was still a baby so his dad could join the SS. Singer himself was said to have been in the Hitler Youth when he was a kid, and then after the war, his mom divorced his dad and she brought little Johnny back to the States to be raised as Mormon. They moved to Utah, he got married in his late 20s, then he and his wife ended up settling on a farm in Marion. He was an active member of the church until the early 70s when he was suddenly excommunicated, but the church never explained exactly why they'd had him removed, and neither did Singer. A few years later, he's openly practicing polygamy, removing his kids from the public school system, then saying a bunch of racist crap to reporters when they went to ask him why. And as you can imagine, this makes him a national hate figure, and when his wife decides that she wants to leave him, he decides he's going to hold his kids hostage. And the cops show up, a standoff begins, and then when Singer points a gun at one of them, a sniper watching from a nearby roof decided to compromise Singer to a more permanent degree, as they say. Singer was dead, but he wasn't some lone kook. He was an influential man in certain more extreme Mormon circles, and when that police sniper shot him down, his followers were pissed. And none more so than a guy named Adam Swap. Swap was 17 when he first heard about John Singer's fight against the feds, and it made him a huge fan. And a few months after he turned 18, Swap decided that he wanted to meet Singer, but his idol was killed before he had the chance. He ended up hanging around the Singer family until he was introduced to John's daughter, Heidi, who he married not long after. But only after gaining the approval of Heidi's mom, Vicky, who he got very close with over the years. The whole family ended up moving into some isolated off-the-grid compound out near Hurricane, where they lived as something of a local curiosity. But then, in early 88, some real strange stuff started happening down there near the Virgin River. The story goes that in early January, Adam Swap approached Vicky Singer, who was still very much the head of the family, and told her God had been talking to him. He said he'd been instructed to place a spear with 9 feathers tied to it, representing the 9 years since Singer's death, into the ground near the LDS church. Then, if he blew it up, the act would actually resurrect the late John Singer. Since the bomb went off on the 9th anniversary of John's shooting, and supposedly at a similar time, too, law enforcement was quick to suspect that the occupants of the Singer-Swap compound were to blame. Vicky Singer's son-in-law was then sent into the compound, basically to ask if they had any involvement, and when he returned, he had bad news. Not only did Swap and Singer admit to planting the bomb, but they had no intention of surrendering peacefully. And that is where we came in. When we arrived at the Singer compound, we knew that we were facing something big. The property was a collection of trailers and makeshift buildings, surrounded on all sides by snow-covered fields, meaning we had to keep our distance and stay behind our vehicles to keep ourselves from being exposed. Word was that the Singers were heavily armed and that they hated anyone with a badge and a gun, so we were very careful not to put ourselves in the firing line. We weren't deputies to them. We were the hand of the oppressor, and they called us modern-day Pharisees, pretenders and tyrants, agents of a corrupt system they'd long since rejected. We knew Swap had told followers to never surrender, and based on the info we'd gotten, we figured that they were fanatical enough to die trying to defend him. Our first goal was to establish a line of communication with the folks in the compound, Negotiators were brought in to try to de-escalate the situation, and over the next few days, we used every tool at our disposal to talk with them. We gave them a cell phone, nothing like you got today, but that worked for a while, until it didn't. We don't know if it ran out of battery or someone got mad, broke it, and then lied about breaking it, but we were forced to use bullhorns and even handwritten, hand-delivered messages at one point. And because no one had died in the LDS chapel bombing, no one was looking at any serious jail time for just blowing up a building. So to us, that meant someone would eventually see sense, come out with their hands up, and not risk getting shot when a good enough attorney could whittle down their sentence to just maybe 2 or 3 years. We were apprehensive but optimistic, and that all changed when we started talking to them. Like I said, they were fanatical, and every communication the negotiators got was filled with all this grand religious talk. They said that they were carrying out God's will, that the U.S. government was on its knees, and that when John Singer rose from his grave, it would signal the coming rapture. In reply, the negotiators asked them to consider the safety of their children, but that only prompted more of that crazy tinfoil hat talk about the end of days, and that was truly scary. Because if they were willing to use their own kids as human shields, what else were they prepared to do? The standoff stretched on, each day colder and more tense than the last. Surveillance showed little movement outside of the compound, though we occasionally saw children's faces pressed against the frosted windows. And at some points, the snow was relentless, and the temperatures dropped way below freezing come nightfall. We took shifts, a mix of local deputies and state cops all huddling behind vehicles and makeshift barricades, divided by agency, but were united in our attempts to keep from freezing our asses off. And at times, the compound was eerily quiet, and every shadow in a window or rustle in the snow put us on edge. And like I said earlier, the Singers were heavily armed, and at the time, we had no idea how many folks were actually in there, so our biggest fear was them rushing us during the night or having some wannabe snipers start taking pot shots at us. We still had hope, but by day 4, that hope was starting to dwindle. Day 4 was when they called the negotiators back and cut off the power to the compound. It didn't do much at first, because they had all kinds of generators and supplies stockpiled for an event such as that one, but it meant a shift from a negotiation mentality to a siege mentality. It also meant that it was only a matter of time before the Singers were forced to do something, be that surrender or come out fighting. Word of the standoff spread quickly, and soon the area was swarming with reporters. Helicopters buzzed overhead and TV trucks lined the nearby roads. Everyone wanted to ask us questions whenever we walked past the tape, and we'd been instructed not to say anything to anybody. Whenever I caught the news when I was off duty, it was crazy to see how divided the public was over the issue. Some saw the Singers as extremists and criminals, while others saw them as victims of government overreach. It added another layer of pressure to an already volatile situation. The eyes of the nation were on us, and any misstep could turn the standoff into a goddamn bloodbath, which, as you can imagine, was hell on our nerves. Negotiations continued on and off for more than a week, and by the 10th day, we were exhausted. Nights were sleepless, and the tension weighed heavy on all of us. Then, on January 28th, after nearly 2 weeks of watching and waiting, the situation came to a head. Adam Swap finally agreed to a surrender, but apparently, his fanatical followers didn't get the message. Then, as officers moved in to take him into custody, some of them opened fire. Shots were fired from inside the compound, and in the gunfight that followed, Lieutenant House, a veteran officer and close personal friend to many of us, was wounded and killed. The loss hit us like a punch to the gut. Swap was eventually subdued and arrested along with Vicky Singer and others. The children were removed from the compound. They were terrified, but thankfully unharmed. The standoff was over, but it cost us dearly. Looking back, it felt more like a clash between law enforcement and a rogue group of survivalists. The Singers wanted to live off the grid, free from what they saw as government interference, but their actions, bombing a church and killing an officer, brought them squarely into the spotlight. They could have lived the life they wanted, but they chose not to. And when they kicked out at the world kicked back. And for me, that's what it's all about. Bad choices leading to bad outcomes. Not just for the person making them, but for the people around them, the ones who'd never have been dragged into things otherwise. The children huddled inside that compound didn't choose that life, and Fred House didn't deserve to die like that neither. Yet here we are, running around in the bitter cold of a Utah winter all because some dumbass lost his goddamned mind. I'll never forget the faces, the tension, and the weight of the decisions we had to make, and as much as I'd like to leave that standoff behind, I know that it'll stay with me to the day that I meet my own maker. During the spring of 1987, I had myself a job working in the forests of Northern California, real middle of nowhere, off the grid kind of place where we stayed on site instead of driving home every night. I'd been working as a sawmill operator for a few years by then, proud to be providing for my family and proud to be doing my part in an industry that kept the local economy alive. The days were long, the air smelled of fresh pine and sawdust, then when we were done, we'd sink some cold ones and then hit the hay, and then do it all again the next day. But then came one morning when everything changed. Not just for me, but for everyone who worked in those woods. I showed up at the mill at dawn, just as the morning sun was beginning to peek over the hills. The air was cool, the mill was quiet, and I drank a cup of coffee with my coworkers before heading out to my head rig. My machine, a head rig, was a massive saw designed to cut through logs like butter, and I knew that thing inside and out. I checked everything over, as I always did, making sure the blades were sharp and the mechanisms were running smoothly, and then when the first log started to roll in, it was business as usual. My job required a lot of focus, a heavy amount of precision, and a healthy respect for the power of the large machinery. It wasn't uncommon for a piece of wood to jump or splinter if something was off, but generally speaking, we knew the risks and trusted our equipment. The log looked ordinary, a straight Douglas fir, no different from the hundreds of others I'd cut that month. But as I fed it into the saw, something happened that will be with me for as long as I live. There was a deafening sound, a metallic screech that set my teeth on edge, and before I knew what was happening, the saw blade exploded. Shards of metal went flying, and the force of the impact knocked me off my feet. It felt like an earthquake had hit the mill. I didn't realize that I was injured at first, and adrenaline has a way of masking the pain, but I looked down and I saw the blood. My face, arms, and chest were covered in it. The jagged pieces of the saw blade had torn into me like shrapnel. My right hand, the hand I'd used to guide those logs every day, was mangled beyond recognition. I felt a sharp burning pain in my eye and then realized that I couldn't see out of it. And after the bang, the mill erupted into shouts and yells. My coworkers tried to help, but their voices sounded distant, like they were coming from underwater. Someone called for an air ambulance while another coworker tried to stop the bleeding. I remember staring at the log, now split open, to reveal a gleaming metal spike embedded deep within the wood. And that's when it hit me. This wasn't an accident. Someone had deliberately put that spike there to try and kill me. The hospital stay was a blur of surgeries and bandages, and I'd later learned that my right hand couldn't be saved and the damage to my eye was permanent. But the physical injuries were only part of the story. The mental scars were just as bad. I trusted that my workplace was safe, that the only dangers were the ones that we were trained to handle. But this was something altogether different. This was sabotage. For those unfamiliar with the practice, tree spiking is a tactic used by nut-job environmental groups to try and prevent logging. By driving long metal spikes into trees, they present a huge danger to loggers because if their blades come into contact with the metal spikes, and as we've already covered here, the freaking blades can explode. But the consequences of their actions aren't just mechanical, they're very human. That spike could have killed me. It could have killed someone else, and that doesn't win me over to their cause, not one bit. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of pain and confusion, but primarily anger. The media got a hold of this story and reporters swarmed the mill, eager to paint me as a victim of an environmental war. I wasn't interested in their narratives. I just wanted to understand why someone would risk my life to make some statement. And did they even once stop to think about the consequences? My coworkers were pretty badly shaken up by what had happened to me, and the incident cast a very strong shadow over the entire mill. Every log that came in was inspected with more scrutiny than ever before, and I heard everyone was very jumpy for a long time after. The company installed metal detectors at great expense, but that didn't do much for people's peace of mind. It wasn't even like everyone was just scared. They were angry, hateful even. They wanted to hang whoever spiked that tree. In recovery, it was a long road. I had to learn how to navigate the world with one hand, how to adjust to the loss of vision in one eye. My wife and kids were my rock, but I'd be lying if I said it was easy. I struggled with depression, with the weight of feeling targeted, even if I wasn't personally the reason for the spike. It was a weird feeling, and it took a long time before I could even think about putting it behind me. In the years since, I've thought a lot about the people who spiked that tree. I've wondered if they ever thought about me and about the damage they caused to my life. I understand their anger at the logging industry. I've seen firsthand the impact of clear-cutting on the environment, but there has to be a better way to make a point than putting lives at risk. Protests should bring actual change, not cause harm to innocent people and turn them off to the cause. Today I'm no longer in the logging industry. I've moved on to other work, something much safer, but the office isn't nearly as exciting or satisfying a work environment as the forests up in NorCal. But every now and then, whenever I hear the hum of machinery, I feel like I'm transported all the way back to that day in May 1987. It still makes me angry sometimes, because no cause, no matter how righteous it is worth the cost of a single human life. What feels like many, many years ago, I was enjoying a short vacation in my family's cabin up in Maine. The cabin was tucked away on the edge of North Pond, and while it was only a few rooms, it was very homely and no neighbors for miles in all directions. My parents would take me and my sisters back when I was just a little boy, and although I didn't much enjoy it at the time, it was a place that I gravitated back towards later on in life. At first, I'd drive up there just to clear my head, but after a while, I started heading out on solo hikes and reliving some of those childhood vacations. So, I was up at the cabin. I'd been hiking all day, and after dinner, I was just about ready to sleep. It had been a quiet night, save for the occasional creak of the wooden beams as they settled into the cool Maine air, and I'd fallen asleep early, but then around midnight, I woke up startled, my senses prickling with the unmistakable feeling that something was very wrong. And at first I thought that it might have just been the wind blowing through the trees outside. But what I heard next didn't quite match the rhythm of the swaying trees. I listened harder, hearing my own heartbeat in my ears as the noise shifted to something more distinct, the unmistakable creak of a floorboard. Someone was inside the cabin with me. I remember just freezing and lying totally motionless in the bed while I listened and tried to figure out what to do. The thought of another person inside sent a chill down my spine, and I knew that I had to do something, so I slowly slipped out of bed, careful to keep the mattress from squeaking. And after putting on my pants and boots, I reached for the flashlight that I kept on the bedside table, and I remember seeing my own hand shaking as I went to grab it. Clicking on it felt like too great of a risk, so I kept it off, grabbing it tightly as I moved toward the door. I'd use it if I really needed it, but until then, I needed to not be seen. The sound of rummaging came from the kitchen. Pots clinked together softly, drawers opened and closed, and whoever it was, they weren't in a hurry, but they also didn't sound like they were afraid of being caught either. My car was outside, so it's not like they could have made a mistake and assumed the place was empty, in which case, were they crazy? Was I safe? Or what were they looking for? My pulse pounded in my ears as I crept down that hall, each step louder in my head than the last as it seemed to go on and on forever. When I reached the corner where the hall opened into the kitchen, I paused and took a deep breath. I then leaned forward just enough to peek around the edge of the wall, and then I saw him. A man stood in the dark kitchen, and his back was to me. He moved quickly but carefully, inspecting the contents of my cabinets and setting aside items that he probably deemed worthy of taking. It was dark, but there was enough moonlight coming through the window for me to see that he wore layers of these tattered clothes and that his hair was very unkempt and his beard was wild. He was also very skinny, like he was sick or didn't eat much, and his movements were eerily calm for someone shifting through a stranger's home. I wanted to say something, to demand that he leave, but the words just got caught in my throat. There was something about him, this overwhelming sense that he wasn't normal, that made him feel less like a person and more like, I don't know, a creature. If there's a black bear eating chicken bones out of your trash, you can't just ask it to leave, and if you approach it, it might just eat your damn face off. And that's exactly what it felt like looking at this guy in my kitchen. I tightened my grip around this heavy flashlight until my knuckles ached from the force. I'm not even joking. And I told myself, if he comes for me when I yell at him, I'm going to hit him with this. And I was just in the process of coming up with something very scary to yell at him when he turned. And for a brief, terrifying moment, we made eye contact. His eyes were piercing, but he didn't seem angry or scared. He just looked tired, like he didn't have a single F left to give. He didn't speak. He didn't try and attack me. He didn't even seem startled to see me standing there. Instead, he just looked at me in a way that I found completely unreadable, and I froze again. My heart was absolutely hammering against my ribs by then, and I braced myself for him to do something, anything aggressive or threatening, but he didn't. He just turned back to his task and selected a few more items, stuff like a jar of peanut butter, a loaf of bread, and a half-eaten pack of crackers. And then when he was finished, he kind of scooped everything into a bag that he had with him and walked towards the back door of the cabin, which I guess was how he got in there in the first place. He opened the door and slipped silently into the night, disappearing into the dark as if though I'd never even seen him in the first place. I stood there for what felt like hours, the flashlight feeling heavy in my hand as my breathing and heart rate returned to normal. The house was creepily still, and the only evidence that he'd even been there was the disarray in my kitchen and the open door swinging gently in the breeze. The next morning, after a sleepless night spent securing the cabin and wondering if he'd return, I learned his name, or rather, the name he'd been given by the locals, the North Pond Hermit. I only found out later that his real name was Christopher Thomas Knight, and for nearly 3 decades, he'd lived in the woods around North Pond, surviving off what he could scavenge and steal. He disappeared into the Maine wilderness in the mid-'80s sometime, turning his back on society entirely, I guess, but no one really ever knew why. Some people talked about him trying to escape something, like a traumatic event or something of that nature. Others believed that he just wanted to be left alone, so he could live out his days in peace away from a society he never understood and who never really understood him either. Over the years, he became something of a local legend. He'd slip into cabins and campsites, taking only what he'd needed: food, clothing, tools, and stuff, but he never caused harm and he never left a trace beyond what he'd taken. People spoke of him with a mix of fear and fascination, unable to figure him out, but somehow understanding of him, and he kept on living that life of raiding cabins and homes until he finally got caught sometime in 2013. I heard he told the cops that he'd managed to survive 27 years without lighting a single fire, and did all his cooking on stolen propane tanks. His arrest made headlines, and everyone was talking about him, but all I could think when I saw his picture was, holy crap, it's you. When I think back to that night, I'm haunted not by what he did, but what he looked like. I saw what I think was a great emptiness in his eyes, like all the humanity was drained out of him. But at the same time, he wasn't there to hurt me. He was simply trying to survive. And even now, years later, I sometimes wake in the middle of the night convinced that I've heard the creak of a floorboard or the rustle of a cabinet door. I'll get up, check the locks, and peer out into the night, wondering if he's still out there, moving silently through the trees, like a ghost in the darkness. I used to do a lot of wilderness hiking in real remote, inaccessible locations, and this is the story of the weirdest, most unsettling thing I'd ever come across. The woods had been quiet that day. I'd been hiking alone for 3 days, and the sense of isolation was starting to feel heavy. The trail was overgrown with trees pressing in close, and the further I went, the less it felt like a trail at all. I liked the feeling, though. It was the reason I visited places like that in the first place, to feel like I was stepping into a world untouched by anyone else. Around mid-afternoon, I came across what looked like a clearing, and then as the trees started to thin out, I saw it. It stood in a small clearing, perfectly centered as if someone had placed it there with care, maybe 8 feet tall and made of dark, weathered wood. It wasn't just a piece of wood, though. It was carved, roughly but with purpose. Faces were etched into its surface, crude and uneven, some long and narrow and others wide and round. They stacked on top of one another, staring out into all directions, and as I stared at them, I figured out what it was. It was a totem pole. But what caught my attention most were the teeth. The totem was covered in them, jammed into the wood like little pieces of decoration. At first, I thought that they were all animal teeth. There were long, curved ones, like from a deer, and sharp ones that might have been from a dog or a wolf. But then I saw others, smaller and straighter, ones that looked almost human. They were yellowed and cracked, and some still rooted in fragments of jawbone, and my stomach turned, and I stepped back on instinct. I didn't stay long. The thing felt wrong, like all those carved eyes were watching me, and I wanted to forget what I'd seen, but it stayed in my mind with me as I walked. The forest didn't seem the same after that, though. The air was heavier, the shadows felt longer and darker, and I decided to cut the day short and set up camp further from the clearing, maybe a mile away. But even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every sound made me sit up, and as much as I told myself it was just animals moving through the underbrush or the wind stirring the trees, I couldn't help feeling like something was out there, watching me. I didn't light a fire. It felt safer to stay in the dark, even though I was freezing, and I thought that I might not sleep a wink that night, but eventually, exhaustion took over and I drifted off. And I dreamed about teeth. And in the morning, I packed up and left as quickly as I could. I didn't go near the clearing again, and I didn't even look back. I've done a lot of solo hikes, but that was the first time that I felt like I wasn't alone, and I didn't like it. And a year later, curiosity got the better of me. The memory of that totem had stuck with me, but I started feeling like maybe I'd been overthinking the whole thing, and started to wonder if I'd imagined parts of it or blown them out of proportion. And so I went back. That time, I brought a disposable camera with me, one of those cheap ones that you wind up by hand, and I wasn't expecting to find the totem again, but I figured if I did, I'd want proof to send to you. And the forest felt different on the second trip. The overgrowth wasn't as dense as I remembered, and the trail was easier to follow, less wild, and I reached the clearing by late afternoon, but the totem wasn't there. The spot was empty, just a patch of dirt and grass where it should have been, and I walked in circles around the area looking for signs that it had been moved, but there was nothing. No drag marks, no holes where it might have been anchored, and it was as if it had never been there at all. But I know what I saw. The teeth, the carvings, the faces. It wasn't something you'd forget, but there was no trace of it. I took pictures of the clearing anyway, just to prove myself that I'd gone back, and when I got the photos developed, they showed really nothing but trees and grass. No shadows or odd shapes in the background, just an ordinary patch of forest. And I stopped telling people about it after that, and the few times I tried, I could see it in their faces. The disbelief, the very polite nods, the way their eyes shifted as they looked for a way to change the subject. And I get it. If someone told me a crazy story like that, I'd probably think that they were making it up too. But I know what I saw. I know how it felt to stand in front of that thing, and how the air seemed to just sort of hum with something I couldn't explain. And I know the fear that kept me awake that night, the sense that something was out there in the dark. And even now, I can't think about it for too long without feeling a chill run down my spine. I haven't been back to that part of the forest since then. I still hike, but I stick to trails that I know, places where other people go, and I don't like to be too far from civilization anymore. It's not the wilderness that scares me. It's the things that you can't explain, the things that shouldn't be there, but are. On a freezing December morning in the year 2001, 3 men climbed into a Soviet-made pickup truck in a rural Georgian village named Leah. It had been a bitter winter, and the cost of keeping warm had skyrocketed. So instead of paying exorbitant prices for coal or gas cylinders, the 3 men came up with a very shrewd but very illegal method of heating their homes. They would drive off the grid into a huge patch of untamed woodland and gather firewood. And their plan was simple. Departing at dawn, they'd drive 30 miles east to a secluded and heavily forested area on the banks of the Nguri River. There, they'd fell trees and chop them into firewood until they were exhausted. But then, instead of driving home along rough and unlit roads in the pitch darkness, the men made the decision to camp out by the river and then drive back home at dawn. Their decision was a practical one. Driving home at night meant running the risk of a police traffic stop, and if the officer found a metric ton of firewood in their truck bed, they'd have some serious explaining to do. The forest southeast of Laya constitutes an area known as the Kolkheti National Park. Kolkheti National Park is known for its vibrant wetlands, along with its diverse flora and fauna, and is considered a UNESCO World Heritage Site. The oldest trees in the park are typically hornbeams and oak species, and due to the region's favorable climate and stable ecosystem, some of them are believed to be more than 1,000 years old. Its status as a World Heritage Site meant logging in the forest was very much illegal, and if caught, the men could expect heavy fines, or maybe even jail time if a judge decided an example should be made. And this is what motivated them to camp overnight and forgo the risk of a perilous nocturnal journey. After spending all day sawing down trees and chopping them into logs, the men were exhausted and ready to make camp. With clear skies and no promise of additional snow, the men hadn't bothered to bring any kind of tent with them. Instead, they were content to melt a patch of snow by lighting a campfire before sleeping on a series of thin, waterproof ground sheets. However, despite having enough logs to make an entire winter's worth of firewood, it was no good to them. To light a campfire, they need to head out into the forest again to find tinder, kindling, and enough dry deadfall of a suitable enough size to feed the flames once they've been summoned. But in the snowy Colchic rainforests of northern Georgia, it was slim pickings. The men searched for more than an hour, walking back and forth in all directions, gathering as much usable firewood as they possibly could. And by 6 in the evening, they gathered a respectable amount, but just to be safe, they decided to head out on one last run before getting to work on the campfire. As the 3 men walked side by side through the trees, the ground before them appeared carpeted by the bright, ethereal white of frost and fresh snow. They talked back and forth, their laughter turning to steam in the evening winter's air, when suddenly they spotted something strange. Ahead of them, a patch of the forest floor, around 1 meter in diameter and forming an almost perfect circle, was completely devoid of snow, almost as if something had covered that patch of earth for the entirety of the recent snowfalls. With their attention transfixed by the solitary blemish on an otherwise untouched snowscape, the 3 men started to approach. And that's when they noticed that not only was the meter-wide circle free of frost and snow, but there appeared to be steam rising from the forest floor. As the men crept closer, the cause of the strange anomaly seemed obvious. Lying in the center of the frostless patch of earth were a pair of small metal cylinders. One of the men leaned down to pick one up with his bare hand, but no sooner than he did, he dropped it, letting out a laugh of surprise as he did so. His companions asked him what it was. "It's heavy," he replied, "and it's warm." The 3 men couldn't agree on what the 2 small objects were, but what they could agree on was that they most likely had some value to them. For example, if they were batteries so powerful that they got warm when fully charged, they most likely came from some expensive and highly specialized piece of equipment. Whoever left them there might pay handsomely for their return, and if not, they'd find someone who would. And what's more, if the charge in the small but curiously heavy metal cylinders held, they would help keep them warm throughout the night. The first of the 2 cylinders was stashed in the woods behind a large rock. The second was brought back to camp with them. The men made dinner, drank some vodka, then settled down to catch a few hours of sleep under a canopy of twinkling stars. Yet before long, they began to feel nauseous. They tossed and turned, unable to drift off to sleep, and then shortly afterward, each man realized that his companions were suffering from the exact same affliction. And at first, they suspected that it might have been the vodka they consumed. When improperly filtered, cheap vodka may contain excess fuel oils. Used during the distillation process, such oils can cause headaches, nausea, and other symptoms if they remain high enough quantities. Cheap vodka can also be contaminated with methanol, a substance which can either cause blindness or death depending on the amount consumed. At the time, this was considered the main culprit. It hadn't been the first time cheap vodka had had such an effect on them, and doubtless it would not be the last. But even after repeated bouts of vomiting emptied their stomachs, the men continued to retch and heave until bile stained the snow a sickly yellow. The nausea, headaches, and vomiting continued for around 3 to 4 hours until finally, the men decided it was time to drive home. They began loading up their pickup truck with the logs they'd felled, but around halfway through the job, they began to feel unusually and excessively exhausted. The men made the decision to return at a later date to load up their remaining firewood, and then began the 30-mile drive back to Laya. When they arrived back at their home village, the men were greeted warmly by those they had sought to provide for. They were pleased that the firewood would offset some of their winter costs, but the 3 men were subjected to a somewhat playful scolding for returning after a night of heavy drinking. However, the 3 men insisted they had not been drinking heavily, but their claim was waved away and laughed off by their fellow villagers. If they hadn't drank themselves into a stupor, would explain their sickly condition. But what they'd eventually discover would horrify them. Following their return from Kolheti Forest, the 3 men retired to their beds to catch up on some well-deserved rest. They slept all day. Then in the early evening, one of the men woke up and began rushing to the bathroom. He suffered from prolonged bouts of diarrhea and noticed with some alarm that there appeared to be blood in his stool. At the insistence of his wife, he visited the village doctor the following morning, but when he did so, the man completely failed to mention his encounter with the heavy metallic cylinders, as well as the eldritch warmth they exuded. Describing exactly what happened would no doubt reveal his illegal activities, and fearing he might also lose out on his strange but valuable find, the man chose to keep the strange objects a secret. Lacking a complete picture on what could have caused the man's symptoms, the village doctor assumed that he was suffering some kind of severe allergic reaction. He administered a shot of powerful antihistamine, designed to counteract the man's unpleasant symptoms. Within just a few hours, the man's condition had improved dramatically, but so had those of his companions who received no such antihistamine shot. Choosing not to question an improvement to their health, the men went about their business as usual for the next week or so, until one day, when they began exhibiting a host of new and painful symptoms. At work, one man complained of a soreness on the skin of his back. He asked a coworker to take a look for him, then pulled up his shirt, revealing a series of painful blisters that ran parallel with his spine. The blisters were surrounded by patches of swollen, tender flesh, as if caused by some kind of intense surface burn. Fearing their illegal logging activities would be uncovered, it took the men 3 whole weeks to report to the hospital in the nearby city of Zugdidi, and when they did, their conditions were dire. They could barely stand up straight by the time they walked through the doors, and initially, despite doctors being unable to determine what was wrong with them, they remained tight-lipped about the small metal cylinders. Only when medical staff explained that their transparency might mean the difference between life and an unimaginably painful death did the men relent and explain what they'd found. After that, their diagnosis was relatively simple. Each man was quite clearly suffering from extreme and highly advanced cases of radiation poisoning. With Zogdidi General Hospital being woefully under-equipped to deal with such an emergency, the men were transferred via helicopter to the Emergency Medical Center in the country's capital, Tbilisi. The EMC set to work making the men more comfortable, while establishing strict quarantine procedures in order to prevent potential contamination. Assuming they were contaminated, their clothes were removed before nurses carefully washed their exposed skin with soap and water. After that, the 3 men were transferred to Tbilisi's Institute of Hematology and Transfusion, where they were isolated and assessed while being given heavy doses of painkillers to dull their intolerable agony. Seeing as radiation weakens the immune system, the open sores on the men's backs had started to become dangerously infected, and upon examination, doctors noticed the telltale inky black of rotten necrotic tissue. The men were quickly given doses of powerful antivirals and antibiotics, and then staff set about organizing blood transfusions to replace the white blood cells killed by the radiation. And then lastly, nurses began to treat the surface burns on the skin of their backs and hands, cleaning them carefully before applying a plethora of lotions, creams, and balms. Once their pain had somewhat subsided, the men were able to talk, and they were interviewed by members of Georgian state security services. It was then that they gave a much more detailed account of their seemingly innocuous misadventure, including the exact locations of the mysterious metal cylinders. Soldiers from the Georgian army were dispatched to Kolkheti Forest, and thanks to the detailed description given by the afflicted men, they were able to quickly track the cylinders down. Equipped with highly protective clothing and using robots to handle the cylinders, the soldiers transferred them into 2 specifically built containers, which limited the direction in which they could emit radiation. They were then transported to a secure facility for analysis by officials from the International Atomic Energy Agency. It took less than 24 hours for scientists to determine that the 2 heavy cylinders were made of a substance known as strontium-90. They'd been part of a radioisotope thermoelectric generator, or RTG, a kind of electrical generator which converts heat released by radioactive decay into electricity. They're often used to power things in remote locations, such as satellites, space probes, or a secluded radio relay in rural Georgia. Many years earlier, the construction of the Houdini hydroelectric station began. Its engineers had hoped that while it was being built, they could coordinate with the distant Nguri hydroelectric station in order to seek their advice and ensure a smooth construction process. There was just one problem. The distance between the 2 stations was so vast that not one, but 4 radio relays would have to be constructed in order for them to communicate. And since this area consisted of vast, untouched woodland, it was considered unethical and impractical to carve out a long strip of it to erect nothing but power lines. There was, however, an alternative solution. Hook the radio relays up with a couple of RTGs, in safe and secure containers, of course, and they could power the radio relays for the next 28 years without chopping down a single tree. And once the construction of the Houdini hydroelectric station was finished, the strontium-powered relay systems became redundant. Then, by the end of the 1990s, the generators were disassembled and the radioactive materials were safely disposed of. At least, that's what people were led to believe. Of the 8 radioactive sources originally installed, only 6 were found. 2 of them were missing. Shockingly, the small atomic faux pas was kept secret from the wider nuclear community, with the officials who swept it under the carpet simply hoping the missing strontium would show up again. Then just a few years later, 3 friends out looking for firewood would suffer the incalculable misfortune of simply stumbling across them. The first man, referred to in the IAEA inquest document as Patient 3MB, was the most fortunate of the 3. He received radiation burns to his hands and isolated patches of his legs, but since he didn't hold or touch the strontium cylinders for any prolonged amount of time, he was discharged from the hospital just a few weeks after presenting himself. The second man, Patient 2MG, was not so fortunate. The large rotting sores on his back, from where he'd lain on the strontium cylinder to keep warm, had become dangerously infected, and in early 2002 he was transferred to a French hospital to receive more advanced forms of treatment. His ordeal was agonizing and he received multiple skin grafts, but ultimately he made a full recovery and was able to leave the hospital on April 18th of 2003. However, the third man, known by the inquest as Patient 1DN, was indisputably the most unfortunate of the 3 men. He too had used the strontium cylinders to keep warm, but after leaning on it much more heavily than Patient 2MG, he received much more concentrated doses of its deadly radiation. While the blisters and ulcers on the back of 2MG were relatively spread out, those on the back of 1DN were much more concentrated and were located on his left shoulder blade. This meant that a series of dangerous infections took hold directly behind the patient's heart and left lung. The patient underwent numerous operations and skin grafts to try and prevent additional necrosis and reverse that which had already occurred. Yet in April of 2004, his condition began to rapidly deteriorate. On the surface of his open wound, there was a large amount of pus secretion, and then following a more thorough inspection, doctors discovered a great deal of secondary necrosis in his muscles, ribs, shoulder bones, and vertebrae. Repeated samples taken from the wound identified polyresistant microbes, such as blue pus bacillus, as being present among the decaying flesh. Polyresistant microbes are named such because they developed a resistance to commonly used antibiotics, and as you can imagine, this presented a dangerous challenge to those charged with Patient 1DN's care. Hospital staff did all they could to fight the infection, but despite a large amount of antibiotic therapy, multi-organ failure loomed large on the metaphorical horizon. On May 12th of 2004, his temperature increased to 39 degrees Celsius, and in the following days, arterial pressure decreased dramatically on account of severe septic shock. And just hours later, Patient 1 DN suffered a cardiac arrest and was pronounced dead at 10:55 p.m. on May 13th of 2004, 893 days after his initial exposure to strontium-90. Patient 1 DN's death marked a tragic end to a brutal but wholly avoidable ordeal, and his loved ones mourned his loss bitterly. Yet the question remained, how could such a horrible thing happen in the first place? Following an inquest into the events, the International Atomic Energy Association claimed that the disintegration of the Soviet Union in 1991 led to a loss of oversight and maintenance for many radioactive devices and installations in the region. Then, without adequate records, security, or a transfer of responsibilities, these devices were left to deteriorate. Seeing as the sources in question were located in a forested and mountainous area in Georgia, their remote placement made them difficult to monitor, and given the secrecy surrounding Soviet-manufactured atomics, it's possible that the newly independent Georgians simply didn't know it was there. Yet perhaps the most concerning aspect is the fact that the strontium-90 cylinders had already been removed from the radio relay. The commonly agreed-upon scenario is that after happening across the radio relays in the chaos of post-Soviet Georgia, a scavenger believed that they were a high-tech variety of battery, quite possibly with a high resale value. He broke into the relay, removed the cylinders, then at some point on his journey home realized that they were killing him. It's quite possible the man expired before giving a full, frank account of what he'd found, leaving those cylinders simply lying there on the forest floor, waiting to seal the doom of their next unfortunate victim. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations.